Hi there. I hope you're having a wonderful summer. Alice and I are having a great one. I'm telling you, it's so nice not to be so hot here in Houston. Normally we have many days over 100 degrees, but I don't think we've reached one this summer. So we're pleased to have a little cooler weather, and we hope you're having a great time where you are. I was just thinking this morning about Dr. R.G. Lee. Two stories come to mind that you may find interesting. One is, Alice and I were attending a large convention once, and they shut down after the morning session and turned out the lights, and we all left and they turned out the lights, and then we remembered that we had forgotten something and we went back in to get it. And when we made our way down to the front of the big convention center where they sat 13,000 or something, kind of fumbling our way in the dark down toward the front to get back to those seats where we had been seated that morning. And suddenly I almost tripped over something. Actually, I almost tripped over someone, because there on his face in the middle of that aisle was Dr. R.G. Lee. Now, you may not know or remember who Dr. R.G. Lee is, but he was the founding pastor and the pastor for 50 plus years of the church that Adrian Rogers pastored for many years, and I'm sure you're more familiar with his name, Bellevue Baptist in Memphis, Tennessee. And Dr. R.G. Lee was a close friend of Alice's and mine. In fact, we have a picture of him holding our now 40-year-old son when he was a baby. And I have an autographed copy of his book called, I think the title is Heaven, a Place That Is, and or A Place Called Heaven. And but I almost tripped over him. He was literally laying on his face in the floor of the aisle of that blackened, dark, lights-out convention center. And I knew that he was praying, and I knew why, because he was the afternoon speaker. But not many preachers would be praying on the floor, on their face, in the middle of the aisle in a 13,000-seat auditorium in the dark. As we got what we came for and headed out the door, not to interrupt him, we were coming in, and two young conventioneers said, "Sir, can you tell us where to get the power turned on in here?" I said, "My wife and I can't tell you, but I think there's a gentleman in the front of the auditorium in the center aisle that will be able to show you how to get the power turned on in here." So I was just so intrigued by the relationship that Dr. Lee had with the Lord and his total dependence upon prayer. And the second story has to do with Dr. Lee when he got elderly. His wife passed away, and unlike a lot of megachurch pastors, which he would have been in his time, very famous, he was called the Prince of Preachers. He had a very famous sermon called Payday Someday. I still have a copy of it on one of those big 33 1/3 record albums. But it was preached over 1,000 times. He was very famous for that sermon. It's an amazing sermon. But he lived in a small home, not anything extraordinary at all, other than it was extraordinarily small and quite simple and old. He had lived there with his wife for many, many years, there in Memphis. And Alice and I were driving through Memphis one day and decided to stop and see him, just to tell him hello. We didn't think our visit would be that significant because he's very famous. But when we got to his house, the housekeeper let us in. We sat down in that small living room, and he came in and sat down with us and began to tell us about his life since his wife had gone to be with the Lord. He said, "Eddie and Alice," he said, "I am so grateful that you came by today to see me." He said, "I see very few people these days." He said, "There was a time in my life when I was world famous and people sought my attention. But," he said, "now that I'm elderly and now that I don't travel like I did," he said, "people don't seek my advice and they don't seek me." And he said, "There's sometimes weeks that I don't see anybody. They don't bother." And when I've asked, I get the answer that they just didn't want to interrupt me. They think that I'm still quite busy and they didn't want to interrupt me. He said, "The truth is, I'm quite lonely." And there are many of us like that. Even Alice and I, as we get older, we're realizing that the demand for our ministry is not as great as it may have been in years past. And the support of the ministry the same. And then one last story. Dr. Lee was on his deathbed, and there at the house, in fact, with his daughter. And as he lay dying, he began to make that transition, having been in ministry 50 plus years, I've been with many people that have made that transition between this side and the other side. And he began to make that transition, and he began to see things that wouldn't be seen with the natural eye. And he said, "Honey, get my book, my book." And she ran to get his book, that book about heaven that I mentioned. And when she got it, he held it up and shook his head and wept. And he said, "This is not it." He said, "I see it." He said, "My book, it's just not it." And what he was telling her was, heaven is so much beyond any type of description I could possibly give it that I'm almost embarrassed that I wrote this book. Well, God has greats in his kingdom, and Dr. R.G. Lee is one. And when you get to heaven, I encourage you to look him up. You'll find him to be a great, great, generous, gracious, godly man. Hey, thanks for listening. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.